Close your eyes. The quiet science begins. Tonight, we gently drift into the secret life of the trees. Your lungs are releasing carbon right now. Carbon that the nearest tree has been quietly preparing to receive for years. This exchange has been happening between your body and the bodies of trees your entire life, without either of you needing to know it. There is nothing you need to do right now. Nothing to follow, nothing to solve. If your mind wants to wander a little, that is fine. If it wants to stay close to these words, that is fine too. The only thing being asked of you tonight is to be here, in whatever way being here feels easy. You are already doing it correctly. The body, when it is horizontal, like this, begins to make its own quiet decisions. The muscles along your back, which have been holding you upright against gravity, for most of the day, start to release their grip. Not because you told them to, but because the floor or the mattress beneath you has communicated something to them. Support is here. Effort is optional. That message travels through tissue and nerve, and the body believes it, gradually in its own time, outside or somewhere not far from where you are. Trees are doing what they have always done at night. They are not sleeping, exactly. That is a human idea placed over a process that has no real equivalent in our experience. But they have shifted. The solar, powered chemistry that drives most of their daytime activity has quieted. The stomata, those thousands of tiny pores on the underside of each leaf, have mostly closed. The tree has drawn inward, not out of fear or rest, but simply because the light that drives its great work has temporarily gone. There is a rhythm to that. The tree leaning toward the day and then settling when the day is done. It is not so different from what your own body is doing right now. A system that ran toward light and motion and noise all day, and is now, with the same uncomplicated logic, beginning to let those things go. You do not have to help it let go. It already knows the way. The oldest trees alive on Earth today were already ancient when the first human cities were being built. There are bristlecone pines in the mountains of California that were saplings before the Egyptian pyramids were constructed, standing now as they stood then in high cold air, growing perhaps 1 millimeter of new wood each year. Not struggling, not in a hurry, just continuing. When we think of old living things, we sometimes imagine they must carry some visible weight of age. But these trees do not look burdened. They look weathered, certainly, twisted by wind and time into shapes that seem almost sculptural, but not heavy. They have found the precise geometry of survival, and they hold it with what can only be described as patience, though patience is not quite the right word either. Patience implies waiting for something. These trees are not waiting. They are simply present, as they have always been present, growing at the rate that their environment makes possible. neither faster nor slower. That quietness is worth considering for a moment. Not the stillness of something stopped, but the stillness of something deeply, continuously alive. A tree at rest on a cold night is still conducting water through its xylem, still holding reserves of sugar in its roots, still making the 10,000 small adjustments of pressure and chemistry that keep it standing and functional. Its stillness is not absence. It is a different kind of presence, one that does not require visibility to be real. Most of the life happening in a forest on any given night is invisible. Not hidden exactly, just not announced. The fungi threading through the soil, the bacteria working on fallen leaves, the roots of neighboring trees, occasionally touching in the dark. None of it performs for an observer. It simply continues. There is something about that, the way so much of what matters happens without anyone watching, that I find myself returning to, quietly. You are lying in that same kind of quiet now. Not absent, present in a softer register. Trees are mostly made of air. This is one of those facts that sounds poetic, but is simply, literally true. About half the dry weight of wood is carbon, and that carbon was pulled directly from the atmosphere, from carbon dioxide floating in the air, absorbed through leaf pores and broken apart by sunlight. The oxygen was released back out. The carbon was kept and built into sugar, and the sugar was built into fiber, and the fiber became the wood. A tree is, in a structural sense, solidified sky. The first person to understand this clearly was a Flemish physician named Jan Baptist van Helmont in the early 1600s. He planted a willow sapling in a pot of weighed soil. For 5 years, he watered it with rainwater and nothing else. At the end, the tree had gained 64 pounds. The soil had lost almost nothing. He was baffled. Where had the mass come from? He guessed water, which was partially correct. He did not yet know about carbon. But he had identified something true, that the material of a tree does not come from the ground it stands in. It comes from somewhere less visible. That question, where does matter come from, really turns out to be one of the more disorienting questions in biology. We tend to imagine growth as addition, as accumulation of stuff gathered from the environment and stacked up. But the tree is not stacking air. It is transforming it. The carbon dioxide molecule enters the leaf as a gas and leaves as something structural, something hard enough to hold a house up. That transformation is driven by light, by photons that traveled 8 minutes from the sun, entered a leaf cell, struck a molecule of chlorophyll, and triggered a chemistry that has been running on this planet for over 3 billion years. The wood beneath your hand, if there is wood nearby, a floor, a table, a frame, contains that history. Light captured and held. What a tree does with water is equally worth considering in a slow and undemanding way. A large oak on a summer day can move 100 gallons of water from its roots to its leaves. Not pumped. Trees have no pumps, no hearts, no muscular contractions. The water moves upward through a process that still carries a quality of quiet elegance when you turn it over in your mind. Evaporation from the leaf surfaces creates a slight tension in the water column inside the tree, like a long, thin thread being pulled from above. That tension travels down through the trunk, through the roots, and draws water in from the soil. The whole system is a column of liquid under tension, held together by the cohesion of water molecules, clinging to one another. This process is called cohesion, tension transport, and it works because water molecules are, in a sense, social. They hold onto each other. A water molecule in a leaf cell, reaching toward the air, is pulling, through that molecular attachment, on a water molecule in the roots, dozens of feet below. The tree facilitates this, but the water, in some sense, does the work itself. There is no forcing. There is no engine. There is a condition created at one end, and the water responds to that condition with the full chain of itself. The body works in ways that have some of this quality too, not driven by constant effort, but by conditions. The conditions for rest are being created right now. The darkened room, the horizontal position, the slower breathing. The nervous system is responding to those conditions the same way water responds to the gradient above it. Not by trying, by following. A tree does not experience the forest the way we experience a landscape. It has no view. It has no vantage point from which to see what surrounds it. And yet it is not isolated. The roots of neighboring trees, in most forest soils, are interwoven with fungal networks that transfer chemical signals, carbon, nitrogen, and water between them. This is not a metaphor. It is a measured, documented process. Radioactive carbon injected into one tree has been detected in neighboring trees weeks later, having moved through fungal filaments in the soil. The mechanism is not mysterious, exactly, but the scale of it is still being understood. In a mature forest, nearly every tree of significant size is connected to this network. The oldest, largest trees, sometimes called hub trees or mother trees in some of the research, tend to be the most densely connected, with the most fungal partners and the most channels for exchange. Carbon has been traced flowing from these older trees toward younger seedlings, growing in their shade, where light is too scarce for the seedlings to produce enough on their own. This does not require the tree to intend anything. It does not require awareness or care in any sense we would recognize. The carbon moves along gradients from where it is concentrated to where it is needed. But the structure that allows that movement was built over decades by organisms that grew together, whose roots found one another's, whose chemistry became compatible. The connection is real even if the awareness is not. Most of what sustains us also moves along gradients we cannot see. Warmth finding skin. Oxygen following pressure into the lungs. Rest arriving, now, into a body that has made itself open to it. The forest at night does not announce its connections. It simply maintains them, quietly, without effort. 30:26 p.m., the trees outside, wherever they are from where you are lying, have already adjusted to this hour. Not dramatically. Just in the way that living systems adjust when one set of conditions gives way to another. During the day, the pressure inside a tree's cells is slightly higher than at night. The water moving through the trunk creates a gentle hydraulic tension that keeps woody tissue firm, a kind of internal pressure that structural engineers would recognize as pre-stress. As night comes and evaporation slows, that tension releases incrementally. The tree becomes, in a measurable but imperceptible way, more relaxed. Dendrometers, instruments that measure the diameter of tree trunks, show that trees are slightly narrower during the day and slightly wider at night. The trunk breathes, in its own way, around the clock. This is not widely known, and there is something in it worth sitting with. The popular image of a tree is static, a fixed pillar of wood, unchanging between one observation and the next. But the trunk is moving. Slowly, within very small margins, but continuously. The whole structure is in a state of dynamic equilibrium, always adjusting, never fully rigid, never fully still. It is closer to the truth to think of a living tree as a process rather than an object. Something that is always becoming, always redistributing, always calibrating the relationship between its parts. The appearance of stillness is the outcome of many small balancing acts happening faster than the eye can track. Your body has this quality too, even now, especially now. The appearance of stillness in a resting body is not a pause in life. It is life running in a different register. Repair, consolidation. The long maintenance work that can only happen when the louder processes step aside. The narrowing and widening of the trunk. The breathing you are doing without thinking about it. Both are the same kind of thing underneath. There is a forest in Sweden, a single Norway spruce, where the visible trunk you would see standing there today is not very old. A few hundred years at most. But the root system beneath it has been carbon, dated to approximately 10,000 years. The tree has regrown its above ground body many times from that same ancient root network. The trunk is, in a sense, temporary. The root is what has continued. When scientists first published this finding, there was some public confusion about whether this meant the tree was actually 10,000 years old. The answer depends on how you define the tree. If the tree is the trunk, the leaves, the visible structure, then no, it is relatively young. But if the tree is the system, the continuous living network, that has been drawing water from that soil and responding to that climate since the last ice age, then yes, something there is 10,000 years old. This question of where a living thing begins and ends, of what counts as the continuous self of an organism, turns out not to have a clean answer. Biology tends to dissolve these boundaries the more carefully you look. The cells in your body are replaced at different rates, some within days, some over years, some like certain neurons, and the cells of your eye lens, present since before you were born. The you that will wake tomorrow is materially different from the you that existed a decade ago, even though there is an unbroken thread of experience and biological continuity connecting them. The spruce's roots know nothing of this philosophical puzzle. They have simply continued doing what roots do, drawing from the earth, holding the ground, anchoring whatever grows above them. That kind of continuity, quiet, structural, unannounced, is all around you tonight. In the wood of the room, in the ground beneath the building, in the slow chemistry of the soil that has been processing carbon since long, before anyone thought to measure it. The rings inside a tree trunk are one of the few places where time becomes legible in a physical structure. Each ring is a year, a wide ring for a year of good rain and warmth, a narrow ring for a year of drought or cold. The rings do not lie, though they speak in a language of relative width rather than absolute record. A dendrochronologist, someone who reads tree rings, can, with a core sample, reconstruct the climate history of a region going back centuries. Some trees have been sampled that contain records of specific historical events. A particularly narrow ring in a tree that was alive in 1816, the year without a summer, when volcanic ash from Mount Tambora dimmed sunlight across the northern hemisphere, tells that story in wood. The tree did not write it. The tree simply grew less, and in growing less, recorded the condition. This is what makes tree rings remarkable, not just as data, but as a kind of archive that the tree accumulated without intention. There was no recording device, no decision to preserve information. There was only growth, responding to conditions, and in that growth, a history was kept. We carry records too, though they are less legible. The body keeps accounts in ways that are not always visible to the person living in it. Patterns of tension in the shoulders, habits of breathing that shortened slightly under years of particular kinds of stress, and that are now, in this quieter hour, beginning to lengthen again. The body's record is not in rings, but in tissue, in posture, in the automatic adjustments it has learned to make. And like a tree in a good year, growing a wide ring in response to favorable conditions, the body in a restful night is adding something to its own continuity. Not dramatically, just by being allowed to do what it does when given the room to do it. The smell of a forest after rain is one of the most widely recognized and liked scents in the world. Studies across cultures have consistently found it among the most positive. Calming, associated with safety, with freshness, with something the nervous system seems to receive as a sign that conditions are favorable. The smell has a name, petrichor. It comes mostly from a compound called geosmin, produced by soil bacteria, actinomycetes, when they are disturbed by rainfall. A secondary layer of the scent comes from plant oils that were absorbed by dry soil and then released when moisture arrives. What this means is that when you smell rain on Earth, you are largely smelling bacteria. Ancient, ubiquitous. Oxygen-producing bacteria whose ancestors transformed this planet's atmosphere billions of years ago. The human nose detects geosmin at extraordinarily low concentrations, far more sensitively than it detects most compounds. Some researchers have suggested this sensitivity is not accidental, that it reflects a long evolutionary association between our species and environments, where that smell meant water was available and biological activity was high. Whether that interpretation is correct or not, the nose responds. Something in the olfactory system receives the compound and sends a signal that travels through some of the oldest neural architecture in the brain, not the reasoning parts, not the language parts, but the deep limbic structures that process emotion and memory, and the basic assessment of whether a given environment is safe. The forest, in that sense, has always communicated with us, not in language, in chemistry, in molecules small enough to cross the boundary between outside and inside without any effort on our part. This is the part I keep returning to, quietly. How much of what the natural world offers has always been addressed directly to the body, bypassing the mind entirely. Trees do not grow symmetrically unless they are given symmetrical conditions, and they almost never are. A tree in an open field grows wider on the south side in the northern hemisphere, where more light arrives. A tree at the edge of a forest leans outward, bending over years toward the gap where sky is visible. A tree that loses a major branch on one side will, over years, compensate by growing more vigorously on the other, redistributing its canopy to rebalance its access to light. This responsiveness is not unique to trees, but it is especially visible in them because the record of each response is permanent. The lean, the asymmetry, the compression wood that forms on the underside of a bent trunk to resist further bending. All of this is the physical biography of a tree's relationship to its specific conditions. No two trees of the same species in different locations will be exactly alike. Each one has been shaped by the precise combination of light angles, wind directions, soil density, neighboring competition, and seasonal variation that it has experienced. Ecologists sometimes talk about the difference between the genome of a tree, its genetic potential, and its phenotype, the actual physical form it takes in response to its environment. The genome is a possibility space. The phenotype is what happened. And what happens is always a negotiation between the internal blueprint and the external world. The you lying here tonight is also a negotiation of that kind. Possibility met with circumstance, year after year, until what exists now, this particular arrangement of habit and tissue and preference, came to be. Not fixed, still responding. Still growing toward the available light, in whatever form that light currently takes. The tree leans, and in leaning, remains rooted. Beneath the forest floor, there is more living tissue than above it. This is not an exaggeration. The root systems of trees in a mature forest, combined with the fungal networks woven through the soil, represent a biomass that, in many ecosystems, exceeds the biomass of everything growing visibly above ground. What we see when we look at a forest, the trunks, the canopy, the understory, is the smaller portion of the living system. The larger portion is underground. In the dark, in contact with minerals and moisture, and the decomposing matter of everything that has lived and fallen there before. Roots do not simply anchor. They explore. The fine root tips of a tree are among its most metabolically active tissues, growing toward water, releasing acids that dissolve minerals from rock particles, forming partnerships with fungi at their very tips. A single mature tree may have hundreds of miles of fine roots distributed through the soil, each tip navigating its local chemistry with something that functions at a cellular level like sensitivity, not sensation in the way we experience it, but a responsiveness to gradient, to chemistry, to contact that produces directed growth rather than random expansion. The tree does not see the soil. It reads it, in a sense, one cell at a time, at the pace of growth. And what it finds determines what it becomes. A tree in mineral, rich soil with good water retention, grows differently than a genetically identical tree in shallow, dry ground. Not because one is better at being a tree, but because each is becoming the tree that its specific earth allows. There is no anxiety in this process. No tree has ever worried about the soil it found itself in. It simply grew in the direction that growth was possible, at the rate that resources permitted, with no comparison to some other version of itself that might have been. The fungal networks in forest soil belong mostly to a group called mycorrhizae, a word that means, roughly, fungus root, because these organisms live in direct physical contact with tree roots, sometimes penetrating the root cells themselves, sometimes forming a dense sheath around the outside. This relationship is not parasitic. It is one of the older mutualisms on the planet, estimated to be at least 450 million years old, older than forests themselves, older than leaves. The tree provides the fungus with sugars it cannot produce on its own, Since fungi cannot photosynthesize, the fungus extends the tree's reach into the soil far beyond what roots alone can access, delivering phosphorus, nitrogen, and water that the roots would not otherwise find. Each partner does what the other cannot. Neither is complete without the other, though neither planned the arrangement. What makes this exchange worth holding in mind is the scale of it. The fungal filaments, hypha, are individually microscopic, but their collective length in a healthy forest soil is extraordinary. A single teaspoon of forest soil can contain several miles of fungal threads, not visible to the eye, not dramatic in any way that announces itself, just present, quietly doing the work of connection that makes the visible forest above possible. The canopy you might see on a clear day. Others call that green architecture of light and air, is in some meaningful sense the surface expression of what the soil is doing underneath. The roots and fungi make the trees possible. The trees make the forest. And the forest makes the conditions, the moisture, the shade, the chemistry of the air, in which everything else in that system lives. Support does not always come from the direction we are facing. There is a process called hydraulic lift that trees perform at night. And it is one of those biological facts that stays with you once you have encountered it. During the day, as a tree draws water upward from the soil, it depletes the moisture in the layers of soil nearest the surface. By nightfall, when transpiration slows, the tree's roots find themselves in contact with soil that is drier than the deeper layers below. Water, following its gradient from wet to dry, begins to move upward through the deep roots, out through the shallow roots, and into the surrounding soil. The tree, at night, is watering its own neighborhood, not intentionally, not strategically, simply because the physics of water movement through its root system. When evaporation from leaves is no longer pulling water upward, allows the deeper moisture to redistribute. Other plants in the area, understory shrubs, herbs, grasses, benefit from this redistribution. Their roots in the morning find soil slightly more hydrated than it would otherwise have been. This process was only confirmed experimentally in the 1980s, though the physics that would allow it had been understood for longer. Before that, no one had thought to look for it. Trees were assumed to be passive participants in soil hydrology, not active ones. The discovery required rethinking the model. The tree was not just drawing from the soil. It was in a continuous exchange with it, giving back at night what it had taken during the day. The relationship between the tree and the ground beneath it is nothing like extraction. It is closer to circulation. The water moves through in patterns that change direction with the time of day, in a system that has been moving this way for longer than there have been people to observe it. Some trees communicate distress through chemistry. when certain species are damaged by insects, when caterpillars begin feeding on a leaf, or beetles bore into bark. The tree responds within hours by producing compounds that make its remaining tissue less digestible, more bitter, more toxic to the thing damaging it. This response has been measured. The chemistry changes at the site of damage, and in some species. It also changes in neighboring leaves that have not yet been touched. The signal travels through the tree's own vascular system, in some cases as a chemical moving through the phloem, in others as a volatile compound released into the air that enters neighboring leaves through their stomata. And in some documented cases, the trees nearby, of the same species, standing within a certain range, also begin producing defensive compounds, as if the message has been received. The mechanism does not require anything like consciousness. The compounds follow pathways. Leaves have receptor molecules that detect certain airborne chemicals and trigger cascades of gene expression in response. The result looks like communication because, in a functional sense, it is. Information about conditions is being transferred from one part of the system to another, and the system changes its behavior accordingly. What is strange and worth sitting with quietly is how thoroughly this dissolves the boundary between individual and collective. Where does one tree end and the chemically influenced forest begin? The tree is real. The forest is real. And the line between them, when you look closely, is more permeable than any border we might draw. Light enters a leaf and is immediately sorted. The green wavelengths, which chlorophyll cannot use efficiently, are reflected, which is why leaves appear green to us. The red and blue wavelengths are absorbed, caught by chlorophyll molecules, arranged in precise arrays inside structures called chloroplasts. A single leaf cell can contain dozens of chloroplasts. Each chloroplast contains hundreds of stacks of membrane where chlorophyll is embedded. The surface area for light capture, folded into a single leaf, is far larger than the leaf's visible surface would suggest. When a photon, a particle of light, strikes a chlorophyll molecule, it elevates an electron to a higher energy state. That electron moves almost instantaneously along a chain of molecules, and the energy of its movement drives the chemistry that splits water, releases oxygen, and builds sugar. The efficiency of this initial energy transfer, the speed and precision with which the excited electron's energy is captured before it can dissipate as heat, is near the theoretical maximum. Some physicists studying the process have found evidence that quantum coherence plays a role, that the electron explores multiple pathways simultaneously and finds the most efficient one. This is still an area of active research, but what is known is that the process is extraordinarily efficient and that it has been refined over 3.5 billion years of evolution. The oxygen you are breathing right now, the oxygen in the air of this room, the oxygen your blood is currently carrying, was released during this process. Not all of it comes from trees, but a significant portion does. The breath in your lungs has passed through leaves. Not metaphorically. The oxygen molecules were produced inside chloroplasts and entered the atmosphere as a byproduct of splitting water with captured sunlight. There is something in that exchange, leaf to air to lung, that has no drama in it. Just continuity. Just the same atoms cycling through forms for as long as there has been life on this planet. The age of a forest is not the same as the age of its oldest tree. This is a distinction that takes a moment to settle into. But once it does, it changes the way a forest feels when you are standing in one. A forest is a community, a structured, self-regulating system of relationships between species that has been assembling itself, layer by layer, over a timeline that may far exceed the lifespan of any individual within it. Ecologists call the process succession. After a disturbance, a fire, a flood, a clearing, the land does not remain bare. Pioneer species arrive, first usually fast, growing plants and shrubs that can tolerate full sun and poor soil. They alter the conditions. Their roots loosen and aerate the ground. Their leaves fall and begin to build organic matter. Insects and birds arrive. Then comes a second wave of species that could not have established themselves without the first wave's preparation. Then a third. Over decades, sometimes centuries, the system moves toward what ecologists call climax vegetation, the stable community of species best suited to the conditions of that particular place. The forest that exists in a given location today may have been assembling for thousands of years. The specific trees you would see are recent, relative to the system. But the system itself, the soil biology, the mycorrhizal network, the accumulated organic matter, the particular mix of species, is old. It carries the history of every succession that came before it. This is the sense in which a forest is more than the sum of its trees. It is a process. The way a river is a process, identifiable, continuous, but made of different water at every moment. There is a quality to old-growth forest that people consistently describe in similar terms across cultures and without coordination. Words like cathedral appear. Words like calm, ancient, held. Researchers studying the physiological effects of time spent in mature forest, a practice the Japanese call shinrin, yoku. Forest bathing have documented reductions in cortisol, the primary stress hormone, reductions in blood pressure and heart rate, increases in the activity of natural killer cells in the immune system. These effects are measurable after as little as 20 minutes, and they persist for days after the exposure ends. The mechanisms being studied include the volatile organic compounds released by trees, phytoncides, particularly from conifers, which appear to have direct effects on the nervous system when inhaled. The visual texture of a forest environment, with its fractal patterning of branches and light, has been found to reduce eye strain and lower physiological arousal in ways that geometric human-built environments do not. The acoustics of a forest, layered, soft, irregular, with no sharp edges in the sound field, activate the auditory system differently than urban noise. The body, it seems, recognizes the forest, not cognitively, not as a named category, but at the level of the nervous system, which evolved in environments very much like this one. The ancient circuits that assess safety and threat read the forest as known, as not dangerous, as a place where the level of alertness currently being maintained can be reduced without risk. Something older than thought recognizes it and loosens. The crown of a tree, the full spread of its upper branches and leaves, is not passive canopy. It is an active structure, continuously adjusted over the life of the tree in response to competition, damage, wind load, and light availability. Each branch grows or retreats based on a local calculation of cost and return. Does this branch receive enough light to produce more sugar than it costs to maintain? If yes, it grows. If no, over time, it is shed. This process of self-pruning is one of the more elegant efficiencies in tree biology. There is no central decision-making, no single location in the tree that evaluates the whole structure and issues instructions. Each part of the tree responds to its own local conditions, and the result of all those local responses, accumulated over decades, is a crown that is remarkably well optimized for capturing light in the specific environment the tree occupies. In a dense forest, trees grow tall and narrow, reaching for the gap in the canopy, keeping their lower branches only long enough to determine they are not worth the cost of maintaining. In an open field, the same species spreads wide and low, filling the available space in all directions. The architecture that results in each case is different, but the logic is the same. Grow where growth is rewarded. Release what no longer serves. The crown at night, closed and still, holds the shape of all those accumulated decisions. Every fork in the branch is the record of a moment when growth continued in that direction, because the light was there. A map of where the sun was over years. Written in wood, there is a particular stillness in the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning that meteorologists and naturalists both note, though for different reasons. Wind speeds at ground level typically reach their daily minimum during these hours, as the convective mixing that keeps air moving during the day and evening settles into its quietest state. In forests, this means that even species with very fine, sensitive leaves, aspens, birches, are motionless during this interval. In a way, they are not at any other time of day or night. A forest in that stillness is not silent. There is sound, insects, distant water, the occasional movement of a large mammal, the soft structural adjustments of wood contracting in cooler air. But the sound has a different character. Nothing in it is urgent. The auditory environment, in the absence of wind-driven leaf movement, becomes more layered and specific, individual sounds distinct against a quieter background, each one locatable, none of them competing. For animals that navigate primarily by hearing, this is a rich environment. For those that navigate by smell, the settled air carries scent further and more accurately. For a human lying still and not quite asleep, it is the kind of quiet that begins to feel textured rather than empty, full of soft information rather than full of noise. The hours you are in now have that quality. The ambient world has settled toward its quietest point. What remains is not nothing. It is a softer version of everything, still present, no longer requiring response. The body knows this hour. It has known it for as long as there have been bodies that needed rest. A fallen tree in a forest is not the end of the tree's participation in the system. It is the beginning of a different kind of participation, one that in some ways involves more species and more biological activity than the living tree could support. The decomposition of a large fallen trunk takes decades to centuries, depending on the species and the climate. During that time, the log moves through a sequence of ecological stages. In the early years, bark beetles and wood-boring insects arrive, creating channels that allow moisture and fungal spores to penetrate. Fungi colonize the wood, breaking down the lignin and cellulose that gave it structural strength. The wood softens. Mosses establish on the surface, retaining moisture. Salamanders and small mammals find shelter in the interior spaces. The nutrients locked in the wood structure are gradually released back into the soil. Foresters use the term coarse woody debris with the matter of fact neutrality of professionals, but the process being described is something more than debris management. A single large fallen log can support several hundred species of invertebrate during its long decomposition. The fungi breaking it down form connections with the roots of nearby living trees, transferring some of the released nutrients back into the living system. The log, in dying, becomes a hub of activity that the standing tree could not have been. There is no loss in this from the forest's perspective. The same carbon, the same minerals, the same patient chemistry, moving from one form of life to another, without interruption, without waste. In a cycle that has been running since first forests appeared on this planet hundreds of millions of years, before the first human eyes were there to see it. The way a tree responds to wind is not simply resistance. A tree that is staked rigidly when young, protected from movement, grows a thinner, weaker trunk than a tree that is allowed to flex. The mechanical stress of bending the repeated loading and unloading of fibers along the trunk. As wind pushes and releases, triggers the production of what is called reaction wood, denser tissue laid down specifically to strengthen the areas under greatest stress. The tree learns the shape of the forces acting on it and builds toward them. This process is called thigmomorphogenesis, growth in response to touch and mechanical disturbance. It operates at the cellular level, where the bending of the trunk is detected by individual cells and translated into changes in how those cells divide and what they produce. No signal comes from outside. The tree's own tissue reads the stress and responds. Over years, the trunk thickens not uniformly, but in precisely the places where strength is most needed. In the orientations that best resist the particular patterns of load the tree has experienced. A tree grown in a windless greenhouse and then placed outside will fail sooner than a tree that has known wind from the beginning. The sheltered tree is not weaker in some inherent sense. It simply has not yet had the chance to build toward what it will face. The capacity for response was always present. What was needed was the condition. This is not a lesson. It is only an observation about how living systems develop. Through encounter, through the pressure of actual conditions, through the slow work of cellular response to what is genuinely present, rather than to what might theoretically arrive. The trunk that stands in the wind and bends and thickens and bends again is not struggling. It is, in the most literal sense, becoming more itself. Bark is not simply a covering. It is a complex, layered tissue with multiple distinct functions, most of them invisible from the outside. The outermost layer, the part you can see and touch, is largely dead at maturity. A corky substance called ridodome that provides insulation, resists water loss, and acts as a physical barrier against pathogens and insects. Beneath it, the inner bark, called phloem, is very much alive, one of the most metabolically active tissues in the tree, responsible for carrying sugars produced in the leaves down to the roots and to every growing part of the tree. The phloem is a one-way river running downward, while the xylem inside it runs upward. Two transport systems moving in opposite directions, never mixing, in a structure no wider in some species than the distance between your thumb and forefinger. The precision of this arrangement. Two countercurrent flow systems in a living tube, maintained continuously, repaired continuously, over what might be centuries, is the kind of engineering that reveals itself fully only when you try to imagine building it. Different tree species have developed bark of radically different character. The thick, deeply furrowed bark of an old ponderosa pine can be several inches deep, insulating the living tissue beneath from the heat of the ground fires that regularly move through its habitat. The thin, smooth bark of a beech, reflects the different evolutionary pressures of a moist, cool forest where fire is rare, but fungal infection is common. The smoothness makes it harder for lichens and mosses to establish footholds that could harbor pathogens. Each bark is a record of the threats the species has navigated over millions of years. A material solution to a specific set of problems, refined over time into something that looks, from the outside, simply like texture. There is a phenomenon in very old forests where the microclimate inside the forest boundary differs measurably from the conditions just outside it. Temperature is more stable, cooler in summer, slightly warmer in winter, because the canopy intercepts heat, and the accumulated organic matter in the soil acts as thermal mass. Humidity is higher, because the trees constantly cycle water from soil to air. Wind speeds are lower, because the tree trunks and canopy absorb and redirect the kinetic energy of moving air. This interior climate, sometimes called the forest microclimate, or in larger intact forests, the forest interior climate, is in part a creation of the trees themselves. The forest does not simply occupy a location. It modifies the conditions of that location to better suit its own continuation. The shade produced by the canopy lowers the temperature at the soil surface, which slows evaporation, which retains the moisture that the trees need. The roots and organic matter loosen and enrich the soil, improving the conditions for root growth and fungal activity. Each part of the system improves the conditions for every other part. Biologists call this kind of self-reinforcing environmental modification ecosystem engineering. But the term, precise as it is, does not quite capture the way it feels to stand at the edge of an old forest on a hot summer day and step inside. The immediate drop in temperature, the change in the quality of the air, the sense of entering a space that is not just different from outside, but actively maintained as different through the continuous, uncoordinated work of thousands of organisms over centuries. You are in your own maintained interior now. Skin holding temperature, breath recycling moisture. A small climate sustained without effort, as it has been every night of your life. The oldest method of aging a tree without cutting it down involves measuring its diameter and applying a species-specific growth rate. It is approximate because growth rates vary so much with conditions that two trees of the same species and same age can differ dramatically in size. A tree that spent its first century in deep shade, suppressed beneath a closed canopy, may be no larger in diameter than a tree of 20 years growing in the open. Dendrochronologists, the specialists who read tree rings, have developed more precise methods using core samples, thin cylinders of wood extracted with a tool that causes minimal damage. The sample, removed carefully and prepared on a smooth surface, reveals the rings in cross-section. Reading them is a skill that takes years to develop, distinguishing genuine annual rings from false rings caused by mid-season droughts, identifying traumatic events in the record, recognizing the signatures of specific climatic periods. The most precise work involves cross-dating, matching the ring patterns from living trees with those from older dead wood or structural timber in historical buildings, building a continuous chronological record called a master chronology. For some regions of Europe and North America, these master chronologies now extend back more than 10,000 years, assembled piece by piece from overlapping records in living trees, preserved logs, ancient timbers, and subfossil wood recovered from bogs and lake sediments. The record is there, in the wood, waiting to be read by someone who knows the language. Every year of the past 10 millennia has left its mark in the growth of trees that were alive during it. The width of a ring is a quiet measurement of a year's weather taken by a living thing that had no intention of recording anything at all. This is the part I keep returning to, quietly, how the tree simply grew, and in growing, remembered everything. Water, inside a tree, is not still even when the tree appears motionless. The columns of liquid in the xylem are under considerable tension. Not pressure pushing upward, but tension pulling upward, the way a chain is in tension when weight hangs from it. This tension means that the water is in a thermodynamic state that physicists describe as metastable. It is technically below the conditions at which it should vaporize, but it does not vaporize, held in its liquid state by the cohesion of its molecules and the narrowness of the channels containing it. If a bubble of air enters the xylem column through a wound, through freeze, thawed damage in winter, the tension in that column is lost. The water column breaks. That vessel is no longer conducting. Trees have evolved several strategies to manage this redundant vessels, so that the failure of one does not compromise the whole. The ability in some species to partially refill embolized vessels under certain conditions, and seasonal cycles of vessel production that effectively rebuild the conducting system each spring. A winter, dormant deciduous tree is, in its above ground parts, largely non-conducting. The xylem vessels of the previous year are blocked or broken. But the tree is not passive during this period. In the roots, metabolism continues at a reduced rate. Carbohydrates stored in the bark and wood are slowly consumed to maintain the living cells. And as days lengthen in late winter and temperatures fluctuate, root pressure begins to build. A positive pressure from below, the reverse of the tension that drives summer water movement, pushing water upward into branches before the leaves emerge. It is this root pressure that drives the sap flow in maple trees in late winter. The brief window, a few weeks long, when the temperature swings above freezing during the day and below at night, creating the conditions for the sap to run. The sugary water that becomes maple syrup is the tree's own stored energy, mobilized into liquid form during this transitional period, flowing upward into branches that are preparing to wake. The tree does not decide to wake. The conditions that allow waking arrive, and the tree responds. The preparation was already complete. Everything needed was already present, waiting for the right temperature, the right light, the right moment. There is a moss that grows on the north, facing sides of trees in temperate forests, not always and not exclusively, but often enough that it was once used as a rough compass by people navigating without instruments. The moss grows where moisture persists longest, where direct sun reaches least, where the bark stays cool and damp through the warmer months. It does not choose these conditions in any deliberate sense. It simply grows where growing is possible, and in growing where it grows, it marks something true about the place. The relationship between moss and tree is not symbiotic in the way fungus and root are symbiotic. The moss takes nothing from the tree and gives nothing back in any direct biochemical sense. It simply lives on the surface of the bark, others in the thin layer of moisture that accumulates there, drawing what it needs from rain and air. It is one of the few plants that can desiccate almost completely, losing nearly all its water content, and then rehydrate and resume metabolism within hours of the next rain, as if the interruption had not occurred. This tolerance for drying and returning is an ancient trait. Mosses are among the earliest land plants, appearing in the fossil record over 400 million years ago. They have not changed dramatically since then, which suggests they arrived at a workable solution early and had little pressure to revise it. They belong to a group called bryophytes, plants that reproduce by spores rather than seeds, that have no true vascular system, that take up water across their entire surface rather than through roots. Others call me lie near moss, or simply to hold the knowledge of it, is to be near something that has been doing exactly what it does, in essentially the same way since before there were trees to grow on, long before there were forests, long before there was anyone to walk through them and notice the quiet green of the north. Facing bark. The sugars a tree produces in its leaves do not stay in the leaves. They move, dissolved in water, through the phloem, that living inner bark, downward to wherever the tree is growing or storing energy, to the tips of roots pushing through new soil, to the cambium, the thin cylinder of dividing cells just beneath the bark that produces new wood on one side and new bark on the other, to storage sites in the trunk and branches where the sugars are converted to starch and held against future need. This distribution is not random. The tree allocates its resources in patterns that reflect its current priorities, growing more where conditions favor growth, storing more when conditions are stable, redirecting energy to wound repair when damage occurs. The mechanisms behind this allocation involve hormones, signaling molecules produced in meristems and leaves, ands, and roots that travel through the plant body and influence the behavior of cells, far from their point of origin. Auxin, produced in growing shoot tips, moves downward and suppresses the growth of side branches, which is why many trees grow with a dominant central trunk, rather than branching immediately at the base. When the tip is removed or damaged, the auxin signal is interrupted, and the side branches below are released from suppression. They begin to grow. The tree's architecture changes in response to a change in the chemical conversation happening within it. This internal signaling, invisible, continuous, occurring across the entire structure of the tree at all times, is a kind of coherence that does not require a center. There is no command location, no single point that holds the plan. The plan emerges from the interactions of the parts, each responding to the signals it receives, each producing signals that others respond to in turn. The tree is, in this sense, a conversation that has been going on for as long as the tree has been alive. In tropical forests, where seasons are defined by rainfall rather than temperature, trees have developed a different relationship with time. In the temperate zone, the annual ring is a reliable unit, 1 year, 1 ring, the rhythm locked to the solar calendar. In the tropics, where some trees grow nearly continuously and others produce multiple flushes of growth in a single year, the ring record is less legible and less consistent. Some tropical species produce no rings at all. Others produce rings, tied to dry seasons rather than winter. This means that the methods developed for reading temperate tree rings do not transfer simply to tropical forests. The chronologies built from bristlecone pines and European oaks do not extend across the equator. The tropics keep their own records in forms that are still being learned. What this points to is that the relationship between trees and time is not uniform. A tree does not experience a year the way a calendar marks one. It experiences the conditions of its environment, the availability of water and light, the temperature of the air, the chemistry of the soil, and it grows or slows or pauses in response to those conditions. The ring is not the tree's record of a year. It is the year's record written in the tree. The tree was only doing what it always does. Sitting with that distinction, there is something that loosens slightly. Time as a set of conditions rather than a container. Growth as a response to what is present rather than a progression along a line. The tree does not move through time. It moves through conditions, and time is what we call the record of that movement afterward. The canopy of a forest, seen from above, from a hillside or a high window, or the gradual altitude of a waking dream, has a texture that no single leaf possesses. Each tree contributes its own particular shape to the collective surface. The rounded domes of oaks, the narrow spires of firs, the irregular spread of a wind-shaped pine at the forest's edge. Together they form a surface that is neither flat nor predictable, that holds its own shadows in its own hollows, that moves when wind moves through it, in waves that are larger than any single tree and different from the movement of any one branch. Ecologists studying canopy structure have found that the irregularity of this surface is not incidental. The gaps between crowns, the spaces where neighboring trees have grown to the edge of their light, gathering territory and stopped, leaving a narrow channel of sky, increase the total amount of light that penetrates to the forest floor. A perfectly flat, closed canopy would intercept nearly all incoming light. The uneven, gap-filled canopy that actual forests develop allows more light to reach the understory, which supports a greater diversity of species below. The irregularity is the function. The apparent imperfection of the canopy, the gaps, the different heights, the asymmetries, is what makes the system more productive and more diverse than a uniform surface would be. This is not a principle that applies only to forests, but it is most visible there, in the way the light falls through in columns and pools, in the way the shadow and the brightness coexist at every scale, in the way nothing is quite even and everything, somehow, is working. There are trees that reproduce vegetatively, sending up new trunks from a shared root system that are considered by some biologists to be single organisms of extraordinary age and size. The most famous is a colony of quaking aspens in Utah, known as Pando, which covers over 100 acres and shares a single root system. Estimated to weigh 6 million kilograms, the individual trunks are genetically identical and rise from the same underground network. They leaf out at the same time in spring and lose their leaves simultaneously in fall. A coordination so precise that Pando is visible from aerial photography as a single unit, a coherent patch in the landscape that behaves as one. Whether Pando is one organism or many is, again, a question that depends on where you draw the boundary. The roots are shared. The genetics are shared. The seasonal timing is shared. But each trunk photosynthesizes independently, interacts with its local environment independently, can be damaged or browsed by elk without the others being directly affected. The answer the biology gives is that the question itself may not have a clean resolution, that life, at this scale, does not always sort into the categories we bring to it. What remains, setting aside the category question, is the sheer fact of continuity. That root system, in its current genetic form, may be thousands of years old, possibly 80,000 years, though this estimate carries uncertainty. Through drought and fire and the slow change of climate, the roots have persisted, sending up whatever the conditions allowed, retreating when necessary, continuing when possible. Continuity does not always look like an unbroken line. Sometimes it looks like a forest that keeps returning from the same ground. The light that filters through a forest canopy onto the floor below is not simply reduced sunlight. It is altered sunlight, changed in its spectral composition by passage through the leaves above. Chlorophyll absorbs red and blue wavelengths preferentially, so the light that passes through or around leaves is relatively enriched in green and far red wavelengths. Others, growing on the forest floor, have evolved to read this spectral signature as information. A pigment called phytochrome, present in virtually all plants, exists in two interconvertible forms, one that absorbs red light, one that absorbs far red. The ratio between them shifts depending on the light environment, and the plant uses this ratio to assess how much canopy is above it. High far. Red relative to red means deep shade, means competitors are close and tall. In response to this signal, some shade, tolerant plants slow their growth and deepen their chlorophyll concentration, investing in capturing the available light more efficiently. Others accelerate their upward growth, stretching toward the gap. The forest floor is, in this sense, a field of ongoing assessment. Every plant growing there is continuously reading the light above it and adjusting its strategy accordingly. The information is not processed consciously. It is processed chemically at the cellular level through molecular switches that have been tuned by hundreds of millions of years of selection to distinguish exactly the conditions that matter most. What is present in the light, the forest reads. What is needed, the forest reaches toward, not urgently. In the unhurried way of things that have time on their side and know, at some cellular level, that the gap will be there. Or it will not, and either way, the response is simply to continue. A single mature beech tree in full leaf is estimated to have approximately 200,000 leaves. Each leaf is a structure of considerable complexity, upper and lower epidermis, a waxy cuticle that regulates water loss, a layer of tightly packed cells for maximum light capture, a spongy interior layer with air spaces that allow gas exchange, a network of veins carrying water in and sugar out, and the stomata on the lower surface, each one a pore surrounded by two guard cells that can swell or shrink to open or close the opening depending on water availability and light conditions. 200,000 of these structures, each one operating independently, each one responding to its own local conditions of light and humidity and temperature, and yet producing, collectively, the coordinated activity of a single tree. The upper leaves, in full sun, operate differently from the lower leaves in shade. The leaves on the south side of the canopy experience different conditions than those on the north. Each adjusts. And the sum of all those adjustments is the tree's total photosynthesis. For the day, its total water use. Its total contribution to the chemistry of the air around it. There is a word in systems biology, emergence, for the properties of a system that cannot be predicted from the properties of its individual components. The behavior of a beech tree cannot be derived from the behavior of a single leaf. The tree is an emergent property of its leaves, its roots, its vascular system, its fungi, its history, all interacting in ways whose collective outcome is something that none of the parts, taken separately, could produce or even contain. This is true of forests. It is true of ecosystems. It is true of the body lying still right now, whose experience of this moment cannot be found in any single cell, or nerve, or breath, but arises somewhere in the whole of all of it, quietly, without needing to be located. Rain falling on a forest does not reach the ground uniformly. The canopy intercepts a significant portion. In dense conifer forests, up to 40% of precipitation never reaches the soil at all, evaporating from leaf and needle surfaces before it can fall further. What does reach the ground has been altered by its passage. Water running down trunks, called stem flow, picks up nutrients leached from bark and accumulated organic matter, arriving at the base of the tree as a chemically enriched solution. Water dripping from leaf tips through fall carries dissolved compounds from leaf surfaces, including compounds the tree has secreted or that have accumulated as dust and particulates. The forest, in other words, processes rain as rain passes through it. The water that enters the soil beneath a mature forest is not the same water that fell from the cloud above it. It has been filtered, enriched, slowed, and redistributed. The canopy converts an event, rainfall, into a process. Instead of one pulse of water hitting bare ground, the forest produces a prolonged, gentle, chemically active delivery of moisture to the soil at rates and in forms that the soil biology can absorb and use most efficiently. This transformation of pulse into process is one of the quieter services that forests perform for the systems around them. Rivers fed by forested watersheds run more steadily through dry periods than rivers fed by cleared land, because the forest has buffered the rainfall, storing it, slowing it, releasing it gradually. The evenness of the river reflects the evenness that the forest imposed on the rain. There is a kind of steadiness that living systems create around themselves, simply by being what they are, not by trying to stabilize anything, by absorbing what arrives and releasing it at the pace that works. The transition zone where a forest meets open land, called an ecotone, supports a different set of species and conditions than either the forest interior or the open ground beyond it. Light penetrates more deeply, wind enters more freely, temperature fluctuates more widely. The soil, exposed to more sun, and evaporation at the edge dries faster than the soil inside. Species that require full sun but benefit from nearby shelter establish themselves here. Others that need the stable interior conditions avoid it. Ecotones are among the most biologically diverse zones in any landscape, the meeting of two systems producing conditions that belong fully to neither. Species from both sides are present, along with species found nowhere else, specialists in the in-between. This edge effect has been studied extensively in conservation biology, where it matters whether a forest remnant is large enough to have a substantial interior, unaffected by edge conditions, or whether the edges have consumed everything. A small patch of forest is, in effect, all edge. The deep interior climate, the stillness, the humidity, the temperature stability exists only in forests large enough to have a core that the edges cannot reach. The interior of something old and large enough has its own climate, its own conditions, a stability that is not rigidity, but deep continuity, the accumulated effect of the system on itself, over time, producing an environment that is gentler, more consistent, more buffered against extremes than anything at the margins could be. You are in your own interior now, not at the edge of anything. Somewhere deeper in, where the fluctuations of the outside day have been absorbed, and what remains is steady and quiet and sufficiently still to simply be in. Trees in a forest do not all photosynthesize at the same rate, even when bathed in the same sunlight. The rate is regulated internally by the availability of carbon dioxide, water, and nutrients, by the temperature of the leaf, and by signals from the rest of the tree about what resources are available and what the current demand is. On a hot, dry afternoon, a tree may partially close its stomata to conserve water, accepting a reduction in photosynthesis rather than risking desiccation. On a mild, moist morning, the same tree may open its stomata fully and run its photosynthesis at maximum capacity. The tree is not optimizing for maximum sugar production at all times. It is managing trade-offs: water against carbon, growth against survival, present gain against future capacity. These trade-offs are managed through the same kind of chemical signaling that governs everything else in the tree. And they shift continuously as conditions change through the day, through the season, through the years. What this means is that the tree is always doing a version of the thing can best do right now, given what is currently available and what is currently at risk, not what it could do under ideal conditions. What is genuinely possible given the actual present moment? The breath you are taking right now is also exactly what is needed right now. Not deeper than needed, not faster. The body has already calibrated to this moment, to this temperature, to this degree of stillness. It is doing precisely what the present requires, without instruction, without effort. with the same quiet competence it has brought to every breath of your life. The wood at the center of an old tree, the heartwood, is no longer alive in the way the outer rings are alive. The cells there stopped conducting water decades or centuries ago. They have been infiltrated with resins, tannins, and other compounds that the tree produces as it ages, substances that resist decay, deter insects, and give the heartwood its characteristic darker color and distinctive smell. The heartwood is the tree's archive, compressed and sealed, the record of all the years before the current living edge of growth. The tree does not need the heartwood to function. Many old trees are hollow at the center. The heartwood rotted away, and yet continue growing vigorously from their outer, living cylinder of sapwood and cambium. The hollow is not an injury the tree is compensating for. It is simply the state that ancient wood arrives at, and the tree has accommodated it the way any long-lived system accommodates what time brings, by continuing to function at the living edge. Where function is still possible, what remains in the hollow is not absence. Owls nest in it. Bats roost in the dry dark. Insects overwinter in the gaps between wood and bark. The hollow interior, no longer needed by the tree for its own purposes, becomes available for other purposes. The tree, in releasing what it no longer requires, makes room. This happens slowly and without any action on the tree's part. The heartwood does not empty itself deliberately. Time and fungi do that work. But the result, the opening of a protected interior space within a living structure, is one of those outcomes in biology that feels, when you sit with it, almost considered. As if the tree, by simply continuing to be what it is, created something that others needed. Leaves fall because the tree releases them. This is not a passive process, not simply a matter of leaves dying and detaching. In autumn, in deciduous trees, a zone of specialized cells forms at the base of each leaf stem. This abscission zone develops a break plane, a layer of cells that weaken deliberately, their walls thinned by specific enzymes. The tree produces, at the signal of shortening days and cooling temperatures. The leaf, when it falls because the tree prepared the release. Before the abscission zone severs the connection, the tree withdraws what it can. Chlorophyll is broken down and its components, including magnesium and nitrogen, are pulled back into the branch for storage. The green color disappears. What remains in the leaf are the carotenoids, yellows and oranges that were always there but masked by the green, and in some species, anthocyanins, red pigments synthesized fresh in autumn in a process whose precise function is still debated among plant biologists. The color of autumn leaves is, in part, the color of a tree conducting an orderly withdrawal, not loss. Managed release, preceded by recovery of what can be recovered, followed by the deliberate opening of a release point that allows the leaf to go when the time is right. The leaf does not cling. The tree does not grieve. The carbon and minerals in the fallen leaf will return to the soil, where they will be taken up again, perhaps by the same tree's roots, next spring, perhaps by the roots of its neighbors. The withdrawal is not an ending. It is a change of form within a cycle that has no terminal point. What the tree knows, in whatever sense knowing applies here, is that what falls was not lost. There is a quality of attention that forests seem to invite, that is different from the attention invited by most other environments. Not focused attention, the kind directed at a specific object or task, but something more diffuse and receptive. The visual field in a forest is complex, but not chaotic. Fractal patterns repeat at multiple scales. The branching of a single twig mirrors the branching of the whole tree, which mirrors the branching of the root system below. The eye moves through this complexity without effort, finding structure at every scale without having to search for it. This quality of effortless structure is now understood to have measurable effects on brain activity. Studies using EEG and functional imaging have found that environments with fractal dimensions in a particular range, the range that natural systems like trees and coastlines and river networks typically occupy, produce a specific pattern of relaxed alertness in the visual cortex and associated areas. The brain is engaged but not taxed. Processing is happening. But it is the kind of processing that restores rather than depletes. The directed attention we use for reading, for problem solving, for navigating complex social environments is a resource that depletes with use and requires recovery. The involuntary attention engaged by natural environments, the soft, receptive noticing that a forest invites, is theorized to be part of how that recovery happens. The mind, released from the effort of direction, rests into the world and is quietly restored by what it finds there. The particular quality of attention you are in right now, not quite directed, not quite absent. Somewhere in the soft space between noticing and not noticing is its own form of this. The mind resting into what is present without needing to act on it. The restoration already underway. A seed contains everything the tree will need to begin, the embryo of the root and shoot, the stored food to fuel the first days of growth before photosynthesis becomes possible, the coat that regulates dormancy and protects against premature germination. In some species, the seed can remain viable for decades. The lotus seeds recovered from a dry lakebed in China and successfully germinated were over 1,200 years old. The life inside them had been suspended, waiting in conditions of minimal metabolism for over a millennium before warmth and moisture signaled that germination was possible. What suspends is not the same as what ends. Dormancy in seeds is an active state, not simply the absence of growth. but a maintained biochemical condition that preserves viability against time. The seed is doing something during dormancy, even if what it is doing is largely invisible. It is holding. Trees invest differently in their seeds, depending on species and strategy. Oaks produce large, energy-rich acorns, fewer of them, each with substantial resources to support germination in challenging conditions. Birches produce tiny, light seeds in enormous numbers, thousands per tree per year, light enough to travel on wind for miles, each one a small bet placed widely across the landscape. Neither strategy is better. Each is suited to different conditions, different probabilities, different relationships with the environment the species has evolved within. The acorn on the forest floor contains, in its dense, small body, the structure of an oak that could stand for 500 years. The whole future architecture, the branching pattern, the root system, the capacity to host hundreds of species, coiled and waiting in a thing you could hold between two fingers. Something about this has always stayed with me. How much future can be held so quietly in so small a space? The pace at which forests change is mostly invisible to a human lifetime. The shifts that take place over decades, the gradual closing of a gap left by a fallen tree, the slow expansion of one species, range as climate shifts. The centuries-long process of soil development under a stable canopy unfold at a rate that appears as stillness to anyone watching from the scale of years. This mismatch between forest time and human time is one of the reasons forests feel ancient even when individual trees are relatively young. What you sense in a mature forest is not just the age of the trees. It is the depth of the accumulated process beneath them. The soil that took centuries to develop. The mycorrhizal network that took decades to establish. The complex understory community that assembled itself species by species over generations. The trees are recent. The system is old. Ecologists sometimes distinguish between fast variables and slow variables in an ecosystem, the things that change quickly, like weather or insect populations, and the things that change slowly, like soil carbon or the genetic composition of a tree population. The slow variables are often the most important. They set the conditions within which everything else operates. They are the stability beneath the surface variation, the deep structure that persists while the surface changes. You carry slow variables too, the deep rhythms of the body, the hormonal cycles, the long arc of nervous system development, the slow accumulation of what experience has built into the structure of who you are. These change on timescales longer than any single day. Tonight is a fast variable. Your rest here, this particular quiet, is real and present and happening now. And beneath it, the slow variables continue their patient work, unchanged and unchanging, solid as old root. The surface can rest because the depth is holding. The forest does not sleep in winter so much as it changes its relationship with time. Below the frost line, in soils that do not freeze completely, biological activity continues at a reduced rate. Bacteria processing organic matter, fungi maintaining their networks, fine roots conducting slow chemistry in cold water. The visible stillness of a leafless forest in January is a surface condition. Underneath, life is quieter but uninterrupted. Some trees prepare for winter months in advance. As days shorten in late summer, before temperatures have dropped significantly, the biochemical preparations for dormancy begin. Sugars are converted to starches and moved to storage. Cell walls are chemically modified to resist ice crystal formation. The proteins in living cells are altered to remain functional at temperatures that would denature their summer configurations. The tree is not caught by winter. It has been moving toward it since August. This preparation is triggered primarily by photoperiod, the length of the dark period each night, rather than by temperature. The tree measures darkness, not cold. Night length is a more reliable predictor of coming winter than temperature, which can vary dramatically from year to year. By responding to the astronomical signal rather than the meteorological one, the tree synchronizes itself to a cycle that is perfectly consistent, the same every year, unaffected by an unusually warm October or a late cold snap. There is a reliability in this that the tree has been depending on for as long as trees have existed. The night lengthening, the preparation beginning, the rest arriving not as an emergency, but as something anticipated and ready for. Dormancy as destination rather than interruption. The dark deepening outside right now is the same signal, arriving in a different receiver. Something in the body recognizes it. Something old and consistent, which has been responding to the lengthening of dark for as long as your kind has existed, is already doing what it does. Already moving toward rest the way the tree moves toward winter. Not reluctantly, but with the ease of something that has always known the way. The wood of different tree species differs so profoundly in its properties that for most of human history, choosing the right wood for a given purpose was a significant technical knowledge in itself. The long, straight grain of ash, which absorbs impact without splitting, made it the preferred wood for tool, handles, and early sports equipment. The dense, fine grain of boxwood, which can be carved across the grain without tearing, was essential for the detailed woodblocks used in early printing. The wrought resistance of yew and black locust made them suited for outdoor structures and fence posts. The resonant properties of spruce, its particular combination of stiffness and lightness, made it, and continue to make it, the preferred choice for the soundboards of stringed instruments. A violin's top plate is almost always Sitka spruce or European spruce, cut on the quarter. meaning the rings run perpendicular to the face of the plate to produce consistent stiffness across the grain. The wood is chosen from old, slow-grown trees, where the rings are narrow and densely packed, producing the most uniform and resonant material. The living tree, by growing slowly in a cool climate, over many decades, was producing, without any awareness of it, material that would eventually be shaped into something that could move a person to tears. The sound of a violin, in this sense, contains the climate of a mountainside and the decades of a slow, growing tree, transformed by craft into vibration, into air movement, into something the ear receives and the body responds to before the mind has named what it is hearing. The tree did not know it was making music. It was only growing at the pace its conditions allowed, in the direction its conditions permitted. The music was always in there, waiting for someone to find it. At the boundary between a tree's roots and the soil, there is a region called the rhizosphere, a zone of intense biological activity that extends a few millimeters out from the root surface. In this narrow band, the root constantly releases compounds, sugars, amino acids, organic acids, and signaling molecules that attract and support the microorganisms whose activity the root depends on. Bacteria in the rhizosphere are often thousands of times more numerous than in the surrounding bulk soil. Fungi are concentrated there. The root is not simply embedded in soil. It is actively cultivating its immediate environment. Some of what the root releases is specifically aimed at particular microorganisms. Leguminous plants release compounds that attract the specific bacteria that will fix atmospheric nitrogen into forms the plant can use. The bacteria, responding to these chemical signals, approach the root and trigger a developmental response. The root forms a nodule. The bacteria enter and establish themselves inside, and the partnership begins. Both partners benefit. Neither could accomplish alone what they accomplish together. The root's relationship to its environment, at this scale, is less like passive absorption and more like conversation, a continuous exchange of signals and substances in which the root shapes what surrounds it and is shaped by what surrounds it in return. The boundary between root and soil at the level of this chemistry is not a wall. It is an interface, a zone of mutual influence, where inside and outside are conducting a negotiation that has been ongoing since the root tip arrived in that particular location. The breath moving in and out of the body right now is also this kind of interface. The boundary between inside and outside negotiated quietly, continuously, without effort, each exchange complete in itself. There are forests where the dominant trees never knew a world without other trees. In the Amazon basin, in the Congo, in the great forests of Southeast Asia, there are canopy trees whose ancestors have occupied continuous forest for millions of years. whose evolutionary history has unfolded entirely within the context of a forest community, never on bare or open ground. These trees did not evolve for a world without neighbors. Every aspect of their biology was shaped in conversation with the other species around them. Their seeds are often large and heavy, dependent on animals to disperse them: fruit bats, tapirs, hornbills, elephants, because in a closed forest, wind dispersal is ineffective beneath the canopy. Their root systems assume the presence of mycorrhizal fungi, with which they have co-evolved for so long that the tree can no longer establish successfully without the fungal partner. Their defensive chemistry has been tuned by millions of years of interaction with specific insects and pathogens that exist only in that forest. These trees cannot be removed from their context without losing what they are. They are not individuals that happen to live in a forest. They are forest beings, organisms whose existence is constituted by their relationships, whose biology is only fully intelligible within the web of the system they belong to. This is not a condition unique to tropical trees. It is simply more visible there, where the interdependency is so deep and so specific. Every living thing on this planet has been shaped by its relationships with other species, with the chemistry of its environment, with the long history of the system it inhabits. The self, in biology, is never quite as separate as it appears from the outside. Something shifts in a forest after midnight that is not quite the same as the stillness of early evening. The animals that bridge dusk and dark have quieted. The nocturnal insects have found their rhythms. The fungi, if you were small enough to observe them at this scale, are conducting their slow work in the soil with a consistency that does not vary with the hour. The trees are at their narrowest diameter of the cycle, their tensions lowest, their chemistry running at its gentlest. There is a word in Japanese, komaribi, that refers to the interplay of light and leaves, the dappled quality of sunlight filtered through a canopy. There is no single word for the equivalent quality of dark in a forest at this hour. The way darkness also filters through branches, pools differently in clearings than beneath closed canopy, holds different depths in different directions. But the experience has been known by every person who has ever sat or lain in a forest at this hour, and the body knows it even now through walls and distance, in the way that knowing sometimes bypasses location entirely. The forest is out there doing what it does. The roots extending, the fungi exchanging, the dormant seeds holding their quiet futures. The heartwood sealed in its ancient dark. The outermost ring of new wood, the thinnest layer, still soft, laid down this very year, completing the record of this particular season before the cambium rests. A ring for this year is being finished, somewhere, tonight, added to all the rings before it. in trees that will still be standing long after every concern of this particular day has dissolved into the same quiet that the forest already inhabits. You are already there, in the quiet. It was never far. There is nothing left to figure out tonight. The mind has been such a faithful companion through the day, sorting and solving and tracking the shape of things, and now it can set that work down. Not abandon it. Only set it down the way you set something carefully on a table when your hands need to be empty for a while. The trees do not think about being trees. They do not hold the concept of themselves together through the night. They simply continue in the dark, doing what living things do when conditions are restful and the requirements of the day have passed. Something in that is worth borrowing quietly for these hours. The body already knows what to do from here. It has known since before you learned language, before you learned your own name. The instructions are older than thought and need no translation. Warmth moving toward the skin, the breath finding its own depth without being asked. The muscles of the jaw, which have been holding something all day without you noticing, releasing now, just slightly, just enough. The shoulders, too. There is almost always something left in the shoulders. A small residual tension that has forgotten why it was there. It can go. The weight of the body is supported completely from beneath. The way the soil supports the root, not effortfully, simply structurally, because that is what it is there for. You are held. The forest tonight is doing what it has always done. Somewhere, roots are moving water. Somewhere, a moth is navigating by the light of stars through branches. Somewhere, the narrow ring of new wood, laid down this year, is cooling, settling. Others calming the record it will always be. None of it requires your attention. None of it is asking anything of you. It continues the way it has continued for longer than memory. The same patient chemistry, the same slow exchange between root and soil and air and light. You are part of that exchange, even here. The carbon in your breath, the water in your cells, the oxygen your blood is carrying, made in a leaf somewhere, released into the sky, drawn into your lungs without effort or intention. You have always been inside this system, not observing it, inside it, made of it. This is not a thought to hold tightly. Let it be loose, the way light is loose when it scatters through branches, present everywhere, concentrated nowhere, simply filling the available space. The available space right now is restful, wide and soft, and without edges. The oldest living things on this planet have not survived by being the strongest or the fastest. They have survived by being responsive, by adjusting, by releasing what the season required releasing, and growing when growing was possible. By being underneath all variation, consistently and quietly themselves. That quality, flexible at the surface, continuous at the depth, is in you too. It has carried you through every difficult season so far. It will continue. Not because you have to make it continue, because that is what the slow variables do. They persist below the surface changes, holding the structure steady, while the fast variables, the days, the worries, the unfinished things, move through and pass. Tonight is passing. Already it is different from when it began. The breath is slower. The thoughts, if there are thoughts, are less sharp at the edges, less insistent on being resolved. This is not a failure of attention. It is attention finding its natural level, the way water finds its level, without effort, by simply being released to move toward where it belongs. Where it belongs, right now, is here. Still, horizontal. Breathing at the pace of something that needs nothing more. The trees outside are breathing too, in their way. Taking in the night, releasing what the day was. The canopy is still. The roots are quiet. The mycorrhizal threads in the soil are conducting their slow exchange in a darkness that has no knowledge of being dark. Everything that was urgent today is still somewhere in the world, unchanged by your rest. And your rest does not diminish it or abandon it. It simply belongs to a different timescale, the timescale of the body, which needs this in the way a tree needs winter. Not as interruption, as part of the cycle that makes everything else possible. The ring being laid down this year in the trees outside contains this night, this particular winter, this temperature, this moisture, this precise combination of conditions. When the record is read, someday, by someone who knows how to read it, this night will be in there, compressed into wood, silent, complete. Your body is also keeping its record. And tonight, what is being added to it is rest, genuine rest, the kind that the tissue knows is real. This will have happened. This will always have happened. This quiet, this warmth, this slow release, already permanent, already complete. Let the breath do what it does. It knows. The jaw is soft. The hands are open, or nearly open, or open enough. The forest is out there, patient and dark, and full of slow work that needs no supervision. You have done enough today. More than enough. The tree does not grow through the night. By trying, it grows because the conditions have been met. The resources are present. And the living system is simply allowed to do what it does. The conditions are met. The resources are present. You have given this night everything it needs. The last thought, if there is one, can be small. A root moving toward water in the dark. A seed sealed and waiting, holding its whole future quietly. A ring of new wood, cooling around a tree that has no knowledge of being ancient, only of being alive, only of continuing. Only of continuing. Sleep well. The forest is keeping its record. The night is doing its work. You can go.